This is the first of 3 lectures on Greek architecture. I'll start by talking about archaic and early classical examples. In my next lecture, I will focus on the Athenian Acropolis, and especially the single most famous work of Greek architecture, the Parthenon. The final lecture will take us to Hellenistic Greece, and especially the Asia Minor city of Pergamon. So before we get into that dizzying array of architectural orders and terms, let's stand back for a moment and think about Greek temples as sacred spaces. You saw this slide back when we studied Sumeria, and you're going to see it again. Indeed, in your next unit, you will write a comparative cultural context essay about sacred spaces, specifically Buddhist and Muslim sacred spaces. Unlike Egyptian mortuary temples or Sumerian ziggurat temples, the Greek temple was very much a public venue. But the main gathering place where sacrifices and rituals were performed was outside the temple. Inside was where the god, or rather the cult statue, resided. While we often refer to churches as houses of God, really they are houses where people gather to worship God. In Greek culture, the temple really was the god's house. Certainly enormous wealth was spent on temples, especially the Parthenon, not only to honor the gods, but perhaps even more to honor the accomplishments of the Greeks. So these were statements of power and authority as well as sacred spaces. A classic example would be the now destroyed statue of Athena in the Parthenon, a statue that may have cost as much to make as the entire temple, which translates into billions of dollars in modern terms. Enormous wealth was also stored in temples, which were storehouses of votive offerings. They often had treasuries. I've referred to ritual and ceremony and to the rather odd fact that rituals and ceremonies took place outside the temples in Greek culture. And finally, as for location, Greek temples were almost always placed on a hill or a citadel. The term polis actually initially referred to this citadel. You've seen this slide before. It's the plan and famous lintel of one of the very first stone temples built as Greece began to emerge from its dark ages. This temple was built at Prineus in Crete and bears considerable resemblance to the Mycenaean megarons that we've already seen. 2 interior columns flank a hearth or sacrificial pit. Earlier temples were built of wood. These have not survived, but some elements of the Greek Doric order temples still show the heritage of wood structures, as we'll see in just a minute. There are a lot of terms here, which should also be in your study guide. Let me go through them quickly and try to indicate which ones you really need to know. The whole temple is built on a stylobate or platform. I've never seen that term show up on an AP test, but it's actually pretty important, and I recommend you know it. The central hall that houses the cult statue is the cella. That is a term you definitely need to know. Greek temples have a front porch, or pronaos, and a back porch, or orpisthodamus. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. While you should know the Greek temples had porches, I don't think you need to memorize these specific terms. If I turn out to be wrong, you can yell at me after the test. Okay, the ugly slide. You have a handout that shows the architectural orders. What I want to do again here is to help you figure out what you need to remember. Unfortunately, answers a lot of this. So you've got that the stylobate is the platform, right? The columns, which are usually fluted, that means that they're carved, have a base, unless they're Doric, when they're often but not always lacking a base. They have a shaft, that's the long, narrow portion, and a capital, or the top. We'll return to capitals. The architrave is the foundation layer of the upper portion of the temple. It's the large rectangle that rests on the capitals. Above that, on Doric order temples, we see triglyphs alternating with metopes. This echoes the construction of earlier wood temples. Basically, the triglyphs represent what would have been the end of the wood beam, the metope, a flat wooden surface that could have been carved. Usually, the sculptured designs will be carved into the metopes on a Greek temple, into stone, of course. On Ionic and Corinthian temples, instead of triglyphs and metopes, we see a frieze, a long, flat, rectangular space with relief sculpture. And of course, that creates a lot more room for relief sculpture than the alternating triglyphs and metopes. The pediment is that triangle right under the roof, right above the architrave and the triglyphs, the metopes, the frieze. It is also a major location for architectural sculpture. Now, pediments create tricky problems for sculptors who are trying to fit a narrative into a very awkward space. We're going to see some of their solutions in a minute. The cornice is the border around the roof, and I think that's enough terms. The easiest way by far to tell the orders apart is by looking at the capitals. Doric capitals are very simple, and I do not think you need to memorize the various parts of a Doric capital. Ionic capital have those scrolls, which are called volutes. They're very recognizable. Corinthian capitals are the most elaborate. They are made of stylized acanthus leaves. The column shapes are also a little different from order to order. Doric temples, which are older, tend to be shorter and heavier, and basically the older they are, the shorter and heavier the columns are. Architects were not yet as confident that they could support the roof with more slender columns. Ionic and Corinthian columns are slimmer and taller. Let me note, by the way, that you'll see almost exclusively Doric and a few Ionic columns in this section. The Corinthian columns were more popular in ancient Rome, and we'll get there all too soon. So here again we see the capitals. Does this help? The Temple of Hera I is one of the oldest stone Doric temples, constructed before Greek architects had quite figured out the whole temple thing. So what was the problem with this design from a functional standpoint? Again, think of this as a functioning sacred space. Well, worshipers simply couldn't get a clear view of the interior and the votive statue. Indeed, because of the internal columns, there wasn't any obvious place to put the cult statue. They had to figure out how to fix this. And there's a term you should know, the entasis, for the widening of the columns, which actually creates an illusion of straightness. Okay, here we go. Sorry about this busy slide, but this pediment from the Temple of Artemis on the island of Corfu illustrates the problem that these triangular pediments pose for Greek sculptors. The sculptors wanted to tell a story. Any idea which story this one's telling? Actually, it's a little confusing. Really, this is a bit of a mishmash of narratives. Medusa, the Gorgon, is guarding the temple, and she has help from a couple of Near Eastern-style guardian lions. Stuck in the corners and hard to see are a couple of examples of gigantomachy. I love that word. What does it mean? Well, it's a term used for depictions in sculpture of battles between the gods and the Titans. The Titans, or giants, were actually the first generation of gods who were overthrown by Zeus and his brothers and sisters. It's a little hard to see, but there's Zeus in one corner and a dead giant in the other. The sculptors also tossed in King Priam from the Trojan Wars, so the pediment has a little something for everyone, without much unity or artistic grace. A treasury wasn't a temple, but rather a storage house for votive offerings. But what you're really seeing here is another example of gigantomachy, and also an example of how much easier it is to show a coherent narrative without contortions when sculpting on a frieze rather than a pediment. Note again that the whole thing would have been garishly painted. I trust by now that you all recognize caryatid columns. You should remember, too, that Egyptians preferred atlantids, or male statue columns, while the Greeks usually used female statue columns, or caryatids. Here we get a better look at the individual parts of the frieze. I especially like the lion taking a nibble out of a giant. Even though this is still Archaic era sculpture and the figures are quite severe, I think the frieze captures a great deal of movement. Note, too, that it uses overlapping to create a greater sense of volume. The figures are still stiffer than we'll see in later architectural sculpture. This temple represents a transition between Archaic and classical temples. It's still Doric, but what differences do you observe? Well, the interior space is opened up, which gave the citizens a much better view of the votive statue in the cella. The columns are more widely spaced. They're also more slender. The sculptor has also come a lot closer to solving the pediment problem. How? He uses standing, bent over, sitting, and prone figures to fit into the triangular space. This way, the figures can all be the same size and the narrative is more coherent. And what is going on here? Well, the Greeks are battling the Trojans, a favorite topic. Athena is in the center, defending Athens. Here you get a closer look at two dying warriors. The West Pediment fellow is classic Archaic, with the lobotomy smile. A lobotomy, in case you don't know that term, is a terrible operation that used to be performed on mentally ill or retarded people to render them more docile, basically by removing chunks of their brain. The East Pediment warrior shows a transition to the severe classical style, although we still aren't seeing the kind of emotion that will appear in late classical and more in Hellenistic sculpture. Okay, now we're going to play a guess the order game. As I was reading up on Greek temples, I found a website that featured the top 10 temples. I do not think that's an official designation. This is a travel site. And I decided to spare you all 10. Still, here are the top 7. Number 1, no surprise, is the Parthenon. It actually has both Doric and Ionic elements. But what are we seeing here, and how can you tell? These are not the heavy Doric columns of 100 years earlier. Still, there is no base, there are no scrolled volutes. The architrave features triglyphs and metopes, not a continuous frieze, so yep, it's Doric. I visited this temple a couple of years ago. It's part of an incredible collection of temples. So what do you think? Which order? No base, no volutes, see the triglyphs and metopes on the front? Again, this one is Doric. It's a little hard to see the capitals, but you should barely be able to make out the triglyphs and metopes. This is a Doric peripteral temple, and it's located on the northwest side of the Agora of Athens. What is the peripteral again? It means a single row of columns in the peristyle. You've already seen this one. The date should be a dead giveaway, as should the short, squat, heavy appearance. At least by Greek temple standards. This is an early Doric temple from the Archaic period. I visited this temple in May 2013 as well. I'll tell you that this is Doric. You tell Ms. Jacobs why that's confusing. Yes, these Doric columns do sometimes have a base. Sometimes Doric columns have bases, although they're very simple. The triglyphs and metopes and lack of volutes still give this one away. If the AP exam asks you about the order that has no base to the columns, by the way, it's asking about Dorics and ignoring this exception. Okay, this temple is both unusual and tricky, so I'm going to give you the answer this time. It is unusual because this temple is aligned north-south in contrast to the majority of Greek temples, which are aligned east-west. The temple is also unusual and, for our purposes, tricky, in that it has examples of all three of the classical orders used in ancient Greek architecture. Doric columns form the peristyle, Ionic columns support the porch, and Corinthian columns feature in the interior. In fact, these are the oldest known Corinthian columns. I wasted a lot of time trying to find a good photo of the Ionic and Corinthian columns, but couldn't. The drawing is a rather romantic effort at reconstructing what the original temple would have looked like. Interestingly, I thought it was drawn by one of Napoleon's officers. You see the Ionic columns with volutes in the foreground, and if you squint, a Corinthian column in the porch at the back. I include this mostly to reinforce the point that sometimes the orders are combined. This temple is part of the Acropolis. It is most famous for its caryatid porch, which you see off to the left. But what about the front? What order is this? This is a very famous Ionic temple and, hint, hint, one that shows up frequently on the AP exam. Note the volutes and the taller, more slender form. This is a famous Ionic order temple and has shown up again, as I said, frequently in the AP exam. Know this one. Yes, I know that these examples are mostly Doric. We're going to see more Ionic and even Corinthian order temples as we move forward in time, especially when we get to Rome. For now, let's move on to the Parthenon.